All right, how's everybody doing today? You guys awake?
Slow nods.
What's
I see.
that? Yeah, it's cold out, isn't it? I woke up this morning and was not expecting or hoping for snow, but indeed that is what we got. Welcome to winter here in October. So what we've been talking about today is, last Friday is competition, but thinking about competition in a different way than the way Locke and Volterra envisioned competition. And we're using a graphical method developed by a guy named David Tillman that is especially suitable for plants because it explicitly models what the actual resources are that an organism needs, a species needs. And so resources in the Locke-Volterra way of thinking about things are just kind of implied in R, in the growth rate. If you don't have the resources that you need, then your growth rate is going to be lower. And so it's kind of implicit in there. Tillman's way of thinking about competition makes the resources explicit. Tillman is a plant ecologist, and so this was especially appropriate for him to be thinking in these ways because plants are rooted in the ground. And so they only have the resource supplies that are provided by that spot where they happen to be rooted. And animals, which is what Locke and Volterra were thinking about primarily, if they don't have the resources that they need, they just pick up and move to someplace else where resources are more abundant. And so different kinds of organisms are more amenable to different ways of thinking about those organisms. So what I've done is I've drawn up on the board here, and let me see if I can pin this. If I know how to pin. Okay, can you guys all see this clearly?
Yes.
Okay. So I've drawn this figure up on the board, which is the figure that we were looking at when we ended up last time. And so on the x-axis, you have light as one particular resource, and you have on the y-axis is nitrogen. So this represents a space of resource supply. Who can tell me where in this space the highest amounts of light and highest levels of nitrogen are?
In the upper right.
Okay, yeah. So here we have high nitrogen and we have high light. And where are the lowest supplies of resources?
Bottom left.
Yeah, bottom left. Low nitrogen and high nitrogen. Or high light, rather. No, not high anything. Low nitrogen, low light. Low nitrogen, low light. What would be up here?
High nitrogen and low light.
And then, of course, over here,
Low nitrogen, high light.
low nitrogen, high light. Okay, so get in your head that this is not a graph of population size, and that's what Locke-Volterra graphed in their models. This is a graph of a resource supply. Now, even though resource supply wasn't being mapped in Locke-Volterra's models, their graphical models, and the math that went into their graphical models, resources were implied. And in the same way, even though population size isn't graphed here formally, population size is implicit in this situation. So if I was going to ask you to think about where population size would be in this situation, where on this graph would you expect the lowest population sizes of species 1 and species 2 to be?
Would it correlate with the low nitrogen and low light?
Okay, so if you had low nitrogen and low light, what's happening in terms of the organisms using those resources?
There's a limit on the amount of resources that they have access to, and so they compete with each other.
So why is there a limit though? So let me use an analogy. We're going to be talking about analogies in lab this week. Imagine that you are at the Golden Corral. You guys all familiar with the Golden Corral? Everybody? Okay, good. So you're at the Golden Corral. You got a buffet there, and because the Golden Corral just opened up after COVID restrictions were lifted, you're the only person crazy enough to go out to eat. And so you're at the Golden Corral and you're all by yourself. Are you now in an environment that is resource rich or resource poor?
Resource rich?
Resource rich, because you're the only individual there and you have this buffet ahead of you. There's no competition. There's just all this food and you have the pick of what you want. Now, it's like 6 months later, we've developed a vaccine, we're all having classes in person, all this stuff. It's great. You go back to the Golden Corral and what do you find? You're there, but who else is there?
A lot of other people.
A ton of other people. And if they're there before you, what has happened to the buffet at the Golden Corral?
The resources are diminished.
It's probably not as plentiful as it used to be. Why? Because there are now more people there. So in the same way that Lotka Volterra's way of thinking about competition dealt mainly with population size and the effect of the two species on the other's growth rate, and in that was implied resources, Tillman's model explicitly deals with resources, but implied in that is population size. So where on this graph would we expect, for example, population sizes to be lowest?
In the bottom left?
In the bottom left, we have very little nitrogen and very little light. Why do we have very little nitrogen?
Maybe there's a lot of plants using nitrogen.
There's a lot of plants using nitrogen. Why do we have very low light levels?
So much vegetation, not a lot of light getting through.
So much vegetation that there are a lot of plants getting the light. So would this correspond to high population sizes or low population sizes?
High population.
This would be high populations. So where would we expect to see low population size on this graph?
Top right.
Top right, exactly. Who is that?
Connor.
Okay, Connor, good. So even though population size isn't explicitly graphed here, if you're out here somewhere, resources haven't been used up. There's a ton of light and there's a ton of nitrogen. Now, as populations grow, because there's a lot of nitrogen and because there's a lot of light, what happens to resource supply of these two resources over time as populations of species 1 and species 2 grow?
The resources start to go down.
Resources start to go down, and so these populations will move in this direction because species 1 and species 2 are both using up light and they're both using up nitrogen. And so as population size increases, you have fewer and fewer resources in the environment because these species have been using them up. Okay, so once again, I don't want you to, in the same way that I don't want you to lose track of resources in the Lotka Volterra way of thinking about competition, I don't want you to lose size of population size in the Tillman way of thinking about resource competition. So they're going to be using these resources up. But in terms of the two species, species one, what does it need most of?
Light.
Species one needs more light. And so it needs less what?
Nitrogen.
Less nitrogen. And how do we, somebody else, how do we know that that's true in this situation?
For species one little graph, it starts further at light, meaning like it needs more light because it can't live as well before that. But then it's
Yeah.
still lower on nitrogen.
Yeah, so if we reflect this down, it intersects the light axis here, which is quite a lot of light, and it intersects the nitrogen axis here, which is very little nitrogen. So because species one needs more light and it needs less nitrogen, one of the assumptions that you could make is that it also uses light faster and uses more light and uses less nitrogen. Actually, I can make this cleaner. We'll just put uses out in front of these. And so we can imagine what we call a resource utilization vector. Resource utilization vector. So what this is just a line that represents how fast a species is going to use the two resources that are being plotted here. And the way we typically do this is by drawing a line between the origin, where there's 0 of the two resources, and we draw a straight line that goes from the origin to the spot in the middle here where the two resources intersect for species one. And so that would be the resource utilization vector of species one. And what it shows you is that for a very little amount of use of nitrogen, it uses a lot of light. So if we do the rise over run kind of thing, calculating the slope of this represents how much does it use nitrogen versus how much does it use light. Does everybody understand why I did that way? In the same way, you can draw something similar for species two. This is the resource utilization vector for species two. Species two needs way more nitrogen than it needs light, so it's going to use a lot more nitrogen relative to the amount of light that it uses. Okay, so generally we would expect species to use up the resources that it needs most the fastest. Does that make intuitive sense to you? I can't see all of you. I just have a strip at the top of my screen. You guys, is that making intuitive sense to you?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So Dr. Judd and I were just talking about this before class, about whether or not this is a realistic sort of expectation, and it makes intuitive sense to me. There's a book that he uses in his upper level ecology class that would flip these resource utilization curves, and I'm like, well, yeah, you can flip them, but I'm trying to wrap my head around why that would make intuitive sense biologically. It's a theoretical possibility, but I'm still having trouble wrapping my head around how it would be that way actually. Why would a species that needs more light than nitrogen actually consume nitrogen at a faster rate than it consumes light, in a sense? So the reason that we want to think about that resource utilization is that this point here in the middle, which I'll represent as pink, this is an equilibrium point. It's a point where there is enough light and nitrogen for both species to coexist. And as long as they have that much light and nitrogen, the two species can coexist at that point, because each species is at its limit. Species 2 is at its nitrogen limit, and species 1 is at its light limit. And so, because neither of them is at the limit of their growth for both of the resources, they're actually at their limit for opposite resources. They can coexist at that point. But then the question is, under what range of resource supply conditions could these two species coexist? And the simple way we do that is we just transfer this resource utilization vector to this data point, to this vector, sorry, to this resource point where the two species can coexist. And we basically draw a parallel line. This line is parallel to this line. And we do the same thing for species 2. This line should be parallel to this line. And what this represents is that within this range of resources, species 1 and species 2 will be able to coexist. Species 2 can coexist when there's more nitrogen than there is light, and species 2 can exist where there's more light than there is nitrogen. But as long as it's inside of this range, it will be able to compete with species 2, and they will eventually reach this equilibrium point. But as soon as you cross this boundary, what happens is, if we put a dot here, if species 1 and species 2 are both here, so I'm going to put 2 dots. Imagine that these 2 dots, rather than being separated by a little bit of space, these 2 dots are sitting on top of one another. But for species 2 uses a lot more nitrogen than it does light. Okay, so we can draw these 2 vectors, and we can reflect what the slope of that resource utilization vector will be. We can do the same thing for species 1, but in this case, it's going to use a lot less nitrogen than it uses light. Okay, and so its vector of resource utilization is going to go this direction. But either way, what happens? What limit do they hit first? Do they hit species 1's limit first, or do they hit species 2's limit first? What line is going to be hit first, a blue line or a black line?
Species 1.
Yeah, you're going to hit species 1's limitation for light first. And the reason you hit species 1's limitation of light first is because you're starting out closer to species 1's light limit than you are to species 2's nitrogen limit. If we did the same thing over here, we would find that the 2 species would reduce resources down to the point that you would hit species 2's lower limit of nitrogen. And at that point, species 1 still has all it needs in terms of light, and it also all it needs rather in terms of light, and it has all that it needs in terms of nitrogen to keep growing, so that when it gets to this point, what does species 1 continue doing? Species 1 is out here with species 2, but species 2 has all it needs in terms of light, and it has all it needs in terms of nitrogen. Species 2, though, is limited by nitrogen. What does species 1 do in terms of population growth?
Continues to grow.
Continue to grow.
It continues to grow. And what is species 2 doing?
Species 2 has like hit a plateau.
Species 2 continues to not grow because it's at its 0 net growth isoncline. And what will happen over here is that species 1 will deplete the amount of nitrogen that is present there until the 2 species are over in this area. And as soon as they're over in that area, Species 1 still has all the resources that it needs to grow, but species 2 now lacks enough nitrogen to grow. And at that point, species 2 will go extinct and species 1 will prevail. Same thing will happen up here. You'll reach species 1's limit in terms of light first. Species 2 still has all the light it needs and all the nitrogen that it needs. It will then grow to the point that it brings the light supply down below the level at which species 1 can survive, and so species 2 in this situation will prevail. So if you start in this area, species 2 prevails. If you start in this area, species 1 will prevail. If you start anywhere here in the middle, the two species will end up at stable coexistence. And you can determine what that range is by looking at what the resource utilization curves are of the two species, the resource utilization vectors are of the two species. Does that make intuitive sense to you? Okay, I'm seeing some nods, I'm seeing some thumbs up. Okay. Speak up if something isn't making sense to you. Any questions about this? Okay. These two species are kind of different from one another, right? But now, let's draw these two species differently. Species 1 is still in black, and species 2 is still in blue. What do you now know about these two species in terms of the things that they need to exhibit positive population growth?
They're the same.
They're not the same, but they're pretty darn close, aren't they? What happens when two species need virtually the same things to survive? Are they going to be able to coexist or not?
No.
They're not going to be able to coexist, are they? Well, how can we illustrate this using resource vectors? So here's one situation where you guys should be glad that you're not having in-person classes, because at this point, if Dr. Jed was doing this or if I was doing this, we would call one of you to the board and we would make you draw this on the board. So using Tillman's way of thinking about this, how can we illustrate to ourselves that this intuitive idea that we have that two species that have really similar resource needs can't really coexist very well together? How would we illustrate that using Tillman's method?
If you use the resource utilization vector, there's not going to be any like space in between them where they can.
Oh yeah. Yeah, exactly. So we're going to draw it for species 1. And then we're going to draw it for species 2. They're really close to one another. So if we project these out from the point where these two zero net growth isoclines are located, the black line would look like this, and the blue line would look like that. So now, because these two species have resource needs that are so similar, this now represents the range of resource supplies that result in stable coexistence. Much narrower range of resource supply, because over here, species 1 wins, and over here, species 2 wins. Down here, nobody can survive. This is negative population goals, their needs them can survive. So once again, whenever you use a model, whenever you encounter a model, a quantitative or a graphical model, you should be able to manipulate that model and then ask yourself, does the findings of that model kind of conform to what I would expect intuitively? And this is intuitively obvious. Two species that have very similar resource requirements should not be able to coexist very often, and that's actually what the model shows. Questions about this? All right then, hearing nothing, I'm going to unpin myself and I'm going to share my screen if I can. Can you guys see the PowerPoints?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So this is what I've just drawn for you. All right, now it's not working. I have had so much trouble sharing screens the last couple of days, and I'm not sure why. So this is, so now can you see this thing changing?
Yes.
Okay, so this is basically what I've just done for you on the board. Two species, there's an orange species and a green species. They have different requirements. Here are the resource utilization vectors. When we transfer them to the place where coexistence is, you see the range of resource ratios where you can expect coexistence to be. If you have two species that are close in terms of their resource needs, there's a really narrow range that you would expect them to coexist on. What if their resource needs weren't similar at all? What would you expect to find in terms of capabilities or possibilities of coexistence?
They'd have a really large capability to coexist.
Yeah, there would be a wide range of resource ratios, the relative abundance of light and nitrogen that would allow them to coexist. And so here we have two species that are now considerably further apart in their resource needs. And as a result, they now have a much broader range of resource ratios, the ratio of nitrogen to light, in which these two species can coexist. So once again, it should intuitively make sense to you what the model is trying to describe.
Can I jump in?
So, yeah, go ahead.
Another way to think about it that should all sort of click together and make intuitive sense is if the plants are using resources, or two species are using resources in very different ways, then interspecific competition, when there's plenty of resources, is going to be relatively weak for those two limiting resources. So we've been talking about the relative strength of inter and intraspecific competition. This is a scenario where that interspecific competition would be weak and you get wide range of coexistence.
Yep, exactly right. So I want to take you back to this situation at Hubbard Brook. So you see a bare landscape here, just a bunch of dead trees, correct?
Yep.
Okay, all right. So what you can't see very well, why can I not see it at all? Oh yeah, there's a stake right here. So just like Dr. Judge showed you a photo chronosequence, a series of photos taken at the same place over time, they also did this in the watersheds at Hubbard Brook. And it's hard to see because it's a black and white photo, but there's a stake right there. It turns out it's a red stake, so I just superimposed a red line on top of it. But they're going to take photos of this environment right here. We know from previous data, so if we go back, sorry, I'm gonna have to click through all this. If we go back to here, after they cut the trees down, what happened to the nutrients in the ecosystem? Alina, what happened to the nutrients in the ecosystem when they cut down the forest at Hubbard Brook? Unmute yourself. Por favor.
Sorry, it wasn't working.
That's all right.
It dropped once they.
Yeah, so when they got rid of the trees, all of the nutrients flowed out of the ecosystem through stream flow. So there was this big export of calcium, big export of potassium, big export of nitrate. So during that time period, let's get back to the photo. What are the resources of light and nitrogen going to be like when this photo was taken? Anybody, can be Elena or anyone else.
Very high.
Which one? What's going to be high?
Light.
Yeah, there's nothing but light here, right? What about nitrogen?
It's going to be a lot of nitrogen too.
Why will there be a lot of nitrogen?
Because no plants are using the nitrogen in the soil.
No plants are using the nitrogen in the soil, so what's happening to the nitrogen that is in the soil?
It's staying there.
What's happening to it?
There's less nitrogen in the soil.
There's less nitrogen because it's flowing out, it's being leached out of the soil, and it's just exiting the ecosystem in stream flow. So where on this graph is this ecosystem?
Bottom right.
It's over here. It's got a hell of a lot of light and precious little nitrogen, because that nitrogen is leaving the ecosystem because they're suppressing the regrowth of the plants. Now, as they let up this suppression, what starts to happen to this ecosystem?
It starts moving to more nitrogen and less light.
Okay, I didn't ask you about nutrients, I asked you about the photo, but describe the photo for me. Was that Connor?
Yeah, that was.
So what's happening with the vegetation?
It's growing, so there's less light available and then more nitrogen available, like gradually.
Yep. So less light because there are leaves now on the landscape competing for light. Plants are competing for light, and there's more nitrogen because those plants are putting down things like leaves. You have litter fall, that stuff decomposes, the nutrients in those leaves go into the soil, and also the plants themselves are absorbing water, slowing down the flow of water through the ecosystem, which also then slows down the flow of nutrients out of that ecosystem. And so you've gained a little bit of nitrogen, but you've lost some of your light. As time goes on, this is at the same spot. You can't, so this is now, there's not a red line there. That's actually the red post because they developed color photography between when one photo was taken and the other, evidently. This is the same spot. You can't even see the post anymore. Now what do you have in terms of total vegetation? Total plant biomass?
It's a lot larger. There's a lot more of them.
There's a lot more biomass, and that biomass is competing for light and nitrogen. But what's happening to light levels?
Light levels are decreasing.
Light levels are decreasing quite a lot. And what's happening to nitrogen levels in those soils underneath all those trees?
They're increasing.
Nitrogen levels are going up. And we get further and further into this chronosequence. Now you can, what's happening at ground level in this photo? Down at the soil surface. Relative to one of these resources.
There's almost no light reaching the ground level.
Yeah, there's almost no light reaching the ground. So all of the competition for light is going to be happening up here in the canopies of these young trees. So once again, we see a decrease in light, and because these trees are bigger, they're putting out more leaves. Those leaves are falling to the ground, being incorporated into soil. Once again, we have a decrease in light and an increase in nitrogen levels. And so one way to think about succession, and back at the beginning, we talked about disturbance as something that happens in an ecosystem that affects the populations of the organisms that are living there, but also in the second definition, it also alters resource availability. And so one way of thinking of succession, which is the response of a community to a disturbance, is to think about what organisms can live in this newly altered environment. And in a lot of cases, these newly altered environments involve significant increases in one resource, while also at the same time, significant decreases in another resource. So we can imagine, if we're thinking about light and nitrogen as two resources, you could put whatever resources you wanted to on this graph, but I think it's informative to think about these two. An early successional species would be a species that requires a lot of light but very little nitrogen, simply because when a disturbance comes through, like clear cutting a forest or a fire in a prairie, what you have is, because you've lost all of the vegetation, you have a high light environment, and because that vegetation isn't holding those nutrients in place, you have the potential for a low nutrient environment. So early successional plants might be those plants that are lowest in their nutrient requirements, but very high in their light requirements. Now, as they grow up, they alter the environment. They take up the space that allows light to come through, and so they are good competitors for light. But as the process of them living and dying goes on, they're adding nutrients to the soil, and that sets the stage for the next suite of species that come in that require less light but require more nutrients. As those plants grow on the landscape, they set the stage by providing more competition for light and by putting more nutrients into the soil. They set the stage for a third species that comes in that requires even less light but requires even more nitrogen. And it goes on and on and on. And so one way to think of succession is a series of changes in the vegetation community, because oftentimes we define succession in terms of the vegetation community. But it's the series of changes in the vegetation community that over time alter the relative ratio of a nutrient to light, for example, one resource to another, such that early successional species require a lot of resource one and very little of resource two, whereas late successional species require very little of resource one and a lot of resource two. So the resource needs of early successional plants and late successional plants will be just the opposite of one another. And the process of succession is each of the players coming onto this ecological stage, their presence on the stage changes that stage, that then makes it possible for the next character to come onto the stage. when that character comes on the stage, they're going to alter that stage such that the first character has to leave by declining population size, but they set the stage for the third character. That third character's presence on the stage changes that stage such that the second character can't thrive any longer, but it sets the stage for the fourth character to come onto the stage. And all of these changes in the stage are changes in resource abundance of resource 1 and resource 2. There I am using another analogy. I don't know if it works for you or not because I just made it up in my head 30 seconds ago. But the ecosystem is fixed. It's there in place. And what's changing is the relative abundances of resource 1 and resource 2 in that set ecosystem. And so the analogy of a stage is appropriate. And what's changing is kind of the set, the infrastructure that is there in the soil, in the environment for those plants to thrive. We can put resource vectors on all of these plants, and so we can see where species 1 and species 2 are capable of coexisting. We can see where species 1 and species 3 are capable of coexisting. And there's really only one area where species 1 and species 3 can coexist, and it's way out here where there's also species 2. But when we look at species 2 and species 3 coexisting, species 2 and species 3 are so close that they can't coexist out here. And so what you see is a series of pairs of species that exist for short periods of time. So the first thing that happens is species 1 comes in, and then it alters the environment such that species 2 can come in, and they can coexist for a short period of time. But when species 2 alters the environment such that it is possible for species 3 to come in, the environment has altered in such a way that species 1 can no longer survive. Then species 4 comes in because species 3 has altered the environment that makes it suitable for species 4, but because it is suitable for species 4, species 3 and species 4 can coexist, but species 4 cannot coexist with species 2. And so you'll go through these pairs of species as you go through this entire sequence of succession. So one way to think about succession is this change in plant species over time, but those changes in who can coexist on the landscape at any given moment is determined by the resources that are available for those species. Dr. Judd and I were talking earlier today, and he's like, you could also add a third resource, and the situation just becomes more complicated because you now have to deal with 3 different resources for each species, and you have to deal with you have to actually deal with a consumption vector that's moving in 3 dimensions rather than 2 dimensions. But let's just stick with a 2-dimensional situation where you can actually envision it.
Yeah, the point here is that for any one resource supply point, you can only get a maximum of 2 species coexisting eventually because you get down to these stable coexistence points. But you could imagine if there was a third, then your minimum for any one area would be 3 species instead of 2. It's the same as the maximum number of species for any one point is the same as the number of resources.
Resource axes.
Yeah. We've been talking about these resource supply points, right? A single point that's defined by a certain amount of light and a certain amount of nitrogen. And that point is going to move around as new players come onto the stage and change the game. You can also imagine an area, right? Resource might vary within a given area such that there are many different resource supply points at any one spot. That should make you think of that habitat heterogeneity stuff that we'll come back to in a little while.
Yeah, so for example, in Puerto Rico, where I've worked in the past, there's a big 16-hectare plot that we have where they do vegetation dynamics work. And in this plot, there's a couple of streams that run through the plot, and there's an area that used to be is relatively uncut primary rainforest, and then there's an area that was clear cut, and then there was an area that was mixed use. And each of these areas have their own suite of species, but also within each of these areas, there are little smaller tributaries and things like this, such that in any given spot in this environment, you might be either down in a valley, or you might be up on the slope, or you might be on top of a ridge. And one of the things that you find is that the suite of species that are up on top of the ridge are different from the species that are on the slope, and those are different from the species that are down at the bottom of the valley. And those differences in the species that are there can all be related to the types of resources that are available at the top of the ridge, on the slope, and down at the bottom of the ridge. And they're very predictable, such that they call it a catina. It's a Spanish word for this pattern. You can see a number of catinas across the landscape as you go up in elevation up the mountain, but the series of trees that you find at the ridge will be very similar from one ridge top to another ridge top on 3 separate catinas. The species that you find on the slope will all be similar, and the species that you find in the valleys will all be similar. Now, when something comes through, when a hurricane comes through and it blows all the trees down on the ridge tops, but not down in the valleys, all of a sudden you have a disturbance, and that disturbance starts the process of secondary succession. And so now this environment, because it's lost all of its trees, is now a high light environment, and a bunch of early successional species that like a lot of light will grow into that space. And that ridgetop will now look different from this ridgetop that didn't get as much damage in a hurricane. So, so that's the heterogeneity that Dr. Judd is talking about. At Kanza, what things lead to this type of heterogeneity, where one spot on the prairie will be different from another spot on the prairie?
The burning of the field.
So burning can lead to heterogeneity. Sure, we've seen photos of how that looks. Who else?
Bison wallows.
Bison wallows lead to heterogeneity. What else can bison do that lead to heterogeneity?
Die.
They can die. That puts nutrients into the soil. What else can they do? Somebody else.
They can graze.
Yeah, who is that?
Grant.
Grant. Oh yeah, so they can graze. So they remove certain types of plants, which then frees up ecological space for other types of plants. So there's all sorts of things that happen in a prairie that lead to heterogeneity. They're different than the things that lead to heterogeneity in a tropical rainforest in Puerto Rico, but there's heterogeneity out there, you know, in any natural system that you look at. So this is what the situation at Hubbard Brook looks like, just to finish this off. After they stop suppressing vegetation, the total plant biomass goes up. But when you look at the individual species that are contributing to this plant biomass, at the very beginning of secondary succession, beech trees are the first ones to grow in, and then sugar maples are coming in, and then it takes a while for other species to come in. And you see that yellow birch is one of the slowest to colonize this new environment, and is increasing in total biomass relatively slowly, whereas beech begins to decline, and it's declining as sugar maple peaks, and then sugar maple declines as pin cherry and raspberry and these other things, decline. And so once again, one species sets the stage for the entrance of another species, and in the process of doing that, it's basically setting the stage for its own demise. And this is the figure from the paper that they published about this, and this is some figures that show the same dynamics in terms of a textbook image showing this trajectory. So when we think about communities, and this is, I think, the last thing that I want to talk to you about, communities have structure. When you go out and sample a plot of land at any point in time, you're going to see a suite of species that are there. Now, the question is, how did that community of species come into existence? And there are two different ways of thinking about this. One way of thinking about this was proposed by a guy named Frederick Clements, and the other one was proposed by a guy named Henry Gleason. And so oftentimes these things are referred to as a Clementian model versus a Gleasonian model. And Clements had this idea that the organisms in a community all act kind of like a superorganism. He uses this term superorganism. But what he basically meant by that is that you will tend to find discrete communities that are all made up of the same species wherever you find them to be. And so you have one community, and then as you move from that community into another community, there's a narrow transition zone, but then it shifts over to a totally different community. And then there's a narrow transition zone that shifts over into another community. And this environmental gradient can be an environmental gradient such that those environmental variables are changing on the same plot of land over time, or it can be a transect where you see the environment changing from one spot on the map to another spot on the map to another spot on the map. And so these associations are represented by a group of species that are associated with one another, not necessarily because of individual resource needs of each species, but because of interactions between the species more so than the resources that they possess or that they have access to. Gleason, on the other hand, held this idea that species are out there doing their individual thing. You know, a big bluestem plant is doing its thing, a lead plant is doing its thing, a goldenrod is doing its thing. And in the process of that, there are some environments that are suitable for one species. There are other environments that are suitable for another species. There are other environments that are suitable for other species. And the reason that these two models can look similar is that at any given plot on the landscape, you're basically looking at a single point. And at the single point, you see species A, species D, species E, and species F. And at this point over here, you see species A, species B, species D, and species G. That's a different community than this community over here. And so by looking at it at these narrow geographic ranges, at these narrow geographic spaces, it looks like each community is its own independent thing. But what's really happening is each individual species is responding to whatever the environmental gradient is in its own individual way. And so this is sometimes referred to as the superorganism idea of Clements. And this is sometimes referred to as the individualistic or the continuum model for a community structure. As it turns out, and Dr. Judd can agree or disagree, I think in the end, what most ecologists have kind of reached the conclusion is that Gleason was much more correct in his ideas than Clements was, that you get these community structures because you get communities of organisms that are all responding in similar ways to a particular environmental gradient, but they're all responding to that environment according to their own species needs. And so in the long run, we tend to think more of an individualistic Gleasonian way than we do a Clementian way, although you still see these ideas coming up in papers occasionally. Would you say that that's the case, Nathan?
I was reflecting on that a little bit over the summer, and it seems like even though Clements sort of won during his time and Gleason kind of changed fields, became a taxonomist, we did move towards more of a Gleasonian worldview, mostly because of people studying trees and how different tree species respond to environmental changes over very long time scales and very large areas. There were many other studies too, but that was a big factor. And I think that now we're somewhere in the middle when we think about the strengths of the various kinds of interactions among species, which we talked about a little bit last time. Predation, competition, facilitation, and mutualism. There are going to be some strong links between some species, and maybe overall you'll have a distribution of many weak interactions, a few strong ones. And so generally we're kind of more on the Glisonian side, but we're probably somewhere in the middle now in terms of the relative importance of resources versus species interactions.
Yeah, there's a guy that I have worked with in the past who's at the University of Connecticut, and his lab actually developed a way of looking at community structure across geographic ranges of organisms to see if communities are structured in a more Clementian versus Glisonian versus pseudo-random versus random versus all of these ways that you can think of communities being structured. And one of the things that it requires is it requires you to have sampled your community at really close intervals so that you can see if these transition points at this transition zone. So we do this up and down a mountain in Puerto Rico, and I've done this with spiders before. As you move up the mountain in Puerto Rico, at the bottom is stuff called Tabanuco forest. It's a forest type. It's a community type based on the plant community. Then you get to what we call Palo Colorado forest because it's got a dominant tree species that is called the Palo Colorado tree. And then you get a band of trees, of plant communities at the top, which are palm forest. It's almost exclusively palms as the dominant tree species. And then at the very top, you get cloud forest. And so we have these plant communities that we think of as being vertically stratified up the mountains in eastern Puerto Rico. But these community types are only really apparent to you if you look at them at this broad picture of the mountain. And so what we did stupidly a number of years ago is we went and every 20 meters up the mountain, we put plots all the way from the bottom of the mountain to the top of the mountain. And that's a fine enough scale that you can see among these Tabanuco plots, are each of those Tabanuco plots really similar to one another or not? And do they go through this rapid transition into Palo Colorado forest? And all those Palo Colorado forests look alike and have the same species in them. And then there's a very rapid transition into palm forest. And then there's a very rapid transition into cloud forest. And that would be very much a Clementian sort of way of thinking about this. And as it turns out, you're about to say something, Nathan?
Finish your thought.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, this kind of thing I find really fascinating because the scale at which you're seeing these differences as you sample is a scale that's just not available to people like me studying pollen or leaf assemblages through time. We just wouldn't see those sharp boundaries. We would see all of those communities together as one in the lake or the stream at the bottom of the valley. And maybe we'd see no change for tens of thousands of years as they just move up and down the hill with various hurricanes.
Yeah, so a bunch of people did this with the trees. They did it with the orchids. They did it with insects and bromeliads. I did it with spiders. Another group, the group that invented this method for testing this, did it with snails. And as it turns out, all of these different kinds of organisms have different kinds of community structure up and down this elevational gradient. The trees really do seem kind of Clementian in their distribution. So if you're just looking back at the broad structure of the trees, it looks very Clementian. But it's a very different story if you look at snails and spiders, as it turns out. So anyway, I think that's the end for me. Do you guys have any questions about that? Now, Dr. Judd and I have just kind of geeked out with one another about community structure, which, sorry you had to see that, but anyway, that is that. The main point that I want you to get is how resources affect the path of succession, and understanding the path of succession in the context of thinking about competition for resources in a David Tillman-esque sort of way. And so hopefully that got through to you over the last 2 days. Questions?
Okay, this question is more for my own edification than for like
Yeah.
conceptually understanding what's going on. But where does the nitrogen in the soil come from when there's no plants, the nitrogen gets like washed away, and if there are plants and it's being used by the resources?
Okay, we're going to talk about this when we talk about nutrient cycling, but there are a group of plants called legumes. They're in the family Fabaceae. We didn't do a plant and animal. Have we done a legume yet, Nathan?
I have one queued up for the start of class next time.
Okay, awesome. So these plants in this family, they have a number of characteristics that are unique to them. These include things like peas. It also includes honey locusts, and on the prairie, it includes lead plant. Are you going to do lead plant?
What did I have here? Yeah, I've got a lead plant here. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll do it for next time. Yep.
Yeah, partridge pea that you saw out at Martha Lafitte Thompson when we first went out to Martha Lafitte Thompson is a legume. These organisms, these plants have things called root nodules in their roots, where they basically have a symbiotic relationship with soil bacteria, and soil bacteria have the ability to convert atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia, and then that is the first step in making nitrogen available to plants. And so nitrogen in the atmosphere is bonded together, 2 nitrogen atoms into a nitrogen molecule with a triple bond. That triple bond is very strong and it's hard to break. And so as a result, you need a particular type of enzyme in order to break that bond, and then start adding things to nitrogen that make it absorbable by plants. And so it's those nitrogen fixing organisms that then put that nitrogen into ecosystems. And as it turns out, it's not uncommon to find nitrogen fixing organisms among the suite of early successional plants in something like forest succession. So we'll get to that.
We only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to take over the screen for a moment. But I just want to say I did kind of blow by that pretty quickly. So if you look back at the attributes of pioneer or early successional species, when we talked about Mount St. Helens last time, it also includes alders, which is another kind of tree. It's not a legume, but it has a different bacteria that can also fix nitrogen. But I'm going to grab the screen.
That answer your question, Tessa?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Dr. Judd is going to set you up for some work for getting you ready for Wednesday.
Next. Oh, wrong screen. Sorry. Okay, so while I pull this up, I want you guys to think, we've been talking about communities and resources and species that use resources. I want you guys to start thinking about this concept of biological diversity. And we've talked a little bit about community structure and some terms there. But in a textbook, you'll usually find, are you guys seeing an Excel sheet or a PowerPoint?
PowerPoint.
Okay, good. You'll usually find a definition for biological diversity. It's something like this: the variation in genetics, phenotypic, and ecological characteristics of organisms, among living organisms. I guess living organisms is redundant. Well, maybe not. You can have dead organisms. Genetic, phenotypic, and ecological variation. But in the context of community ecology and in the context of Kanza Prairie, we're going to talk primarily about species richness, the abundance or sort of proportion of individuals in each species, and the composition, exactly which species are present in communities. So this is what we mean by biodiversity in the context of the Kanza Prairie and community ecology. So this is a slide you already saw, so you can access that. And these are some terms you're going to have to learn about. So I'm going to give you some preparation homework and want you to come up with some definitions, work through some basic math problems and then we'll get into how we quantify diversity at Konza Prairie. So look for that on Moodle this afternoon.
Thanks for coming.